Hello, incredibly beautiful community. Pushing health a little bit because this is an important conversation for which I need to be up. And you can look me in the eyes. I'm going to take off my silly glasses. And we're going to look at a question that's come in many, many times since the election, but in the most direct form, it's come in from Damien. Hi, Damien. And Damien runs one of the best video essay channels on YouTube, Science Fiction, with Damien Walton. Damien asks, Vlad, I hope you don't mind me giving the full question. I'm tail spinning that the Trump-Musk beast backed by Russia is going to be full fascism. If you can reassure me in one of your Q&As, that would be great. I think what's triggering me is that the US elites just decide it's easier to join Autocracy Inc. and go full authoritarian. I talk a lot about love. And one of the many forms of love I have in mind when I talk love with you is that while I have no time for Trump, somebody on social media calls him Mango Mussolini, I have time and love for Trump voters. I don't have love for Trump voters to give them my love. I barely interact with any Trump voters. But I have love for Trump voters as a way of holding something that you may or may not find it possible to hold for yourself at the moment, right? So I love them not for them, I love them to model something for you about being together in the same boat with all fellow citizens, whether that's in America, whether that's in any democracy from where you're watching me. Damien's worried that the Trump-Musk beast is going to land us in a very, very bad place. I won't legislate on the F word. We'll just take it for the purpose of this conversation to mean something really, really bad and undemocratic. One of the reasons I started my channels is to be able to have a connection with some of you at a time when we need to gather ourselves, when democracy is genuinely on the line. And so here is the short answer, Damien, if that's all right. The short answer, sort of mano a mano, if we're having a cigar together, having a glass of wine together, is no. Don't freak out now, but understand that we're likely to face a bigger version of the challenge we're facing now in the 2030s. So take this not as the cyclone that's coming over is going to blow over all the buildings. Take this as a cyclone that, if we respond to it properly, could put us in better stead for reacting to a bigger one in the next decade. So historically, that's how I would put it. The time to catastrophize isn't now. The time to get closer to catastrophizing while still being constructive is a little bit later, and now this is a dress rehearsal. And many of the letters I got just as I was starting my channels are all about this. What do we do in a moment where democracy is genuinely on the line? How do we get ourselves psychologically and practically ready for that moment? And that's one of the things that we're looking at together over time here, and we still have time for that. When we talk about something terrible that might happen, that could mean the death of democracy, we have to understand, and I Twitterized that earlier in a kind of elliptical way that nobody could get because it wasn't well expressed. But one of the things that we've got to really understand is that democracy has two senses. There is a banal sense of democracy, which is just making sure that you can get the guys out of power who are in power by voting them out of power. And that's banal, not in the way that Coke and McDonald's is banal. It's banal in the way water and basic nourishment is banal. That's to say, it's really important, it's really sacred. I call it banal because it's simple. Because whatever normative or evaluative disagreements we might have, we can clearly visualize what it's like not to be able to vote a government out of power. It's something simple, banal, in that sense, banal like water and the sacred basics of life. But then there is a richer sense of democracy, a more telic sense of democracy, which is about where are we all going together. It's the rich sense of democracy. And Trump is a calamity for both the rich sense of democracy, he has no constructive story to tell, and for the banal sense of democracy, because he is an anti-institutional post-truth populist. He is in good part out to break democratic institutions. He isn't as vehement about breaking them as other pestilences that'll come our way will be in the future. But he is not somebody who just breaks institutions as a byproduct of elevating his career without ever intending to break institutions. He's a bit more determinedly out to desacralize our democracy. And that's why he's not just a political entrepreneur, he is a destructive authoritarian post-truth populist. What we've got to understand, however, is that unless we have a rich story of democracy that's working for us, we're going to run aground on the banal story. A society can't sustain itself long without a compelling, rich story of where democracy in that society is going. And as a result, 10 years, 20 years, 25 years of lacking that rich story is going to lead to a problem with democracy in the banal sense. And what this means is that there's a lot on the Democrats, right? The Democrats are in many ways a party that engineered their own defeat. In my analysis, and this confused a few people, I've given the Trump campaign an E to an F, allowing for Trump's communicative genius and for his brilliant political instincts. It's still an F because there is so much that could be there destructively that's missing, because the guy is more of a Mango Mussolini than a hard-nosed operator who can combine the skills of genius that Trump has with the political discipline and seriousness of a Viktor Orban. So Trump is actually easy to beat if you get the rich story right. What does getting the rich story right mean? It means the Democrats understanding that there is a legitimacy crisis in the country, that institutions and politics, as usual, is leaving people with the impression that their politics has in fact left them behind, that they can't touch it. All of these feelings of distrust, again, right? They can't touch politics. Politics feels opaque. It feels like politics betraying them. It feels like politics leaving them powerless. They can't do anything about it. To begin running that story, Biden needed not just to be a more efficacious, practical politician than Obama, which he was, despite his palpable cognitive decline. And I'm going to give a special piece on why his cognitive decline is both a cause of great damage to US democracy, but why it also didn't affect his core decision-making. And again, it's that middle position that is so hard to stabilize amid the algorithmic currents out there, right? Saying that Biden is a puppet, doesn't run anything on the one hand, on the other hand, there's nothing wrong with him at all. But Biden would have needed to connect his constructive policy making with an articulated bigger project of renewing democracy, which means a new way of talking that speaks beyond the technocratic centrist lingo that you normally get to ordinary voters. It means a focus on working Americans. It means deep empathy for how they have lost trust. It means reassuring them that you have control over the borders. Because if you don't control the borders, you don't have a country. Instinctively, that's how a lot of voters feel. It also means you don't go by economic stats. You go by the fears and the hardships and the fears about the perpetuation of the fears that ordinary citizens have. You relate to that, you put that center, and you tell a big story that starts with the admission that the country has been going in the wrong direction, that it's losing its, that the politics in the country is losing its people. This is ubiquitous, this is a West-wide phenomenon. The Labour government in the UK has a huge majority, but it has an outside chance of being the last ever Labour government in British history because of that gap, because centrist politics has found itself floating at such a big distance from what the concerns and sentiments of a very large minority or a very small majority are in the country. So you've got to understand that this is in many ways a self-engineered defeat against an eminently beatable opponent. And that the way out of this is to tell a big, rich story of democratic renewal. It's unlikely that that story will be told. And it's likely that US democracy will continue to slide. But is it possible to offer a project of such renewal, to present it properly, right? For all the policy challenges that might come, it's not easy to deliver in an institutionally complex and polarized democracy. But that project of renewal is available, and if the Democrats implement it, they would win in 2028, virtually irrelevant of who runs on the Republican side. So that's where we're at. But even if such a rich project isn't offered, the Trump-Musk team, as you put it, is unlikely to break US democracy in the next 4 years. It's likely to do it damage, but it's likely to leave it sufficiently intact for there to be 1 or 2 or 3 more chances, right, to get that rich picture of democracy on the table. If you don't do that, if you never do that, if you never get the rich picture right, the banal picture will eventually catch up to you and your democracy will collapse. The reason this is going to be such a slow process for most Western democracies, especially in the United States, is because they are quite institutionally resilient. They can sustain for a long time in crisis. Crisis is compatible with democratic sustenance. Democracy persists remarkably through crisis. So the way to think about this is the way we're going, we're going to have a huge problem keeping our democracies 10, 15 years from now. That's where I would emphasize our emotional sort of attention. I don't want to say that we are at that critical juncture yet, which is facing a lot of risks and dangers, but that's it. So that's how I'd put this. There's a lot to be said about Musk, and I don't think we need to go into him, except perhaps for the observation that Trump and Musk are likely to quarrel, maybe even in a matter of months. What's triggering me is that US elites just decide it's easier to join Autocracy Inc. and go full authoritarian. When people lose a sense of responsibility, it's always about 2 things. Integrity, but also stability, or if you like, deep integrity. Put politics aside, just look at YouTube, right? Just look at how the vast majority of the Trump support on YouTube is just a product of algorithmic grift that eventually gains sincerity, actually. If you look at somebody like Jordan Peterson, he is too psychologically unstable to resist algorithmic grift. That's one of the reasons for his extraordinary success, combined with his remarkable qualities, his electrifying way of speaking, is that in a period when citizens feel that some kind of crisis is happening politically, in a period where there is genuinely a crisis of men. Again, let's not deny that. just because that's something that's said on the X, intellectual dark web part of the internet. There's a crisis of men. And it's not a surprise that a man who is very existentially lost is a kind of leader for men who themselves feel lost. And that's Jordan Peterson. That's an example of many, right? Of somebody who is inadvertently submitting to algorithmic pressures. So we haven't spoken about politics yet, but that's an example of that kind of drift. And in politics, it's the same. You need two qualities. You need integrity and you need stability, not to drift. And one of the patterns we're seeing on the right is the development of the post-constitutional right. I often talk about this. You know, this is a broken record of mine, that we're in a political environment dominated on the right by ex-conservatives, conservatives who are no longer conservatives but are populist authoritarians in conservative clothes. There are many deformations in the center. They're deep. That's why there is this extravagant self-engineered defeat by the Democrats against an easily beatable opponent, right? There are many pathologies in the center. There are many pathologies on the center left. We've talked about hyper-identity politics being one of them, and it's now time to stop pretending that that wasn't the real problem. But these pathologies are toxic for democracy, but they don't directly attack checks and balances and the sustenance of democracy in the banal sense, whereas the drift on the right does do that. It does directly attack our democratic checks and balances. And that's another muscle we need to develop, right? So we've talked about this muscle that we develop for when our democracy was on the precipice of being lost, perhaps in the 2030s. We also need a kind of muscle to judge when a politician has transcended, gone over that boundary of being constitutional to, in fact, questioning our institutions. How do you do that? How do you judge that? We'll talk about that. Because you've got to make a call accurately about this, right? You look at somebody, it doesn't matter who it is, let's say it's Vivek Ramaswamy. Has he gone over the wrong side here? And if he has, exactly why and how does it look? We'll be working together on developing that muscle of telling apart constitutional from unconstitutional conservatives, and also watching constitutional conservatives who are rapidly losing their constitutionalism and becoming anti-democratic. So we need to go gentler with the tailspin, because this is a long-run game, and the critical period of the game is actually not now, it's going to come later. In terms of this business of US elites just deciding to join Autocracy Inc., you've got to have this two-pronged approach. You've got to listen to people like Anne Applebaum, who are very articulate about what it is that's happening to these people, what it is that's happening on the post-democratic right. She's talked very articulately about that drift in Eastern Europe. But if you just listen to Anne, you'll never fix democracy, because she talks about the expression of that pathology, but she doesn't talk about, and that's not a problem that she doesn't, it's not her game, but she doesn't talk about how it is that centrist politics has fallen so out of touch with the country it's representing. And that's got to be a rich conversation about democracy, because Anne's doing the banal conversation, which is critical, and I myself do the banal conversation most of the time. But we've got to do the rich conversation, and we've got to think about how politics learns to do it better. Unless it does, we're going to have a crisis of banal democracy. You cannot sustain banal democracy, institutions voting your government out, unless you get a rich story going. We don't have one. We don't have any prospects of developing it at the moment, looking at the political forces that are mainstream. But unless in the United States, the Democrats do better on this, we're going to have a much more urgent crisis than we do today of what I call banal democracy. If we lose our democracy, if we lose the United States as a democracy by 2040, it will not be because of the Russians. The impact of the Russians will be vanishingly small. But it's still worth thinking about in two ways. Number one, the direct ways in which they're doing malign foreign interference on us, but also the indirect way, and this is more interesting, in which some of post-truth Russian propaganda is actually a kind of a global disease that's floating around and infecting our own politicians, infecting folks on the right who are ceasing to be conservatives and becoming post-constitutional. We always need to keep an eye out for that, but it won't be the Russians if we lose our democracy. And what Putin wants from us is, in fact, to go into a tailspin and not be able to tell that rich democratic story. If we fail to tell it, it's because we haven't done it. Now, of course, Putin's own view is that there is no such story to tell because democracy isn't real, and all such stories are just forms of participation in false consciousness, which is bullshit. But that's how I'd put it overall. We're thinking to the 2030s when it's going to get more existential than it is today. And we've got to use the low-level existential crisis we're facing today to prep ourselves properly. We've got to understand that these two senses of democracy are conjoined, and you simply cannot afford to ride roughshod over a crisis of rich democracy, thinking that banal democracy will sustain because it just should, because the people who question it are just irrational and we've got to call them out. No. You've got to fix the rich story, otherwise you're going to have citizens who want to give up on democracy in the banal sense. And when there is this gap of legitimacy, when mainstream politics isn't meeting people's needs, you've got to understand that you'd go wrong underestimating the intelligence of the voter. You might not go wrong understanding the truthfulness, underestimating the truthfulness of the voter, right? Trump voters are operating outside of cause and effect and engaged in magical thinking. But there is more intelligence and truthfulness there, right? These are people reacting to something very, very wrong in their political environment, very, very wrong with their politics, and in a counterproductive way via magical thinking outside of cause and effect, they're trying to fix it. So that's how it began to ground us. Now, let's do a very trivial glasses joke to finish. One of the most embarrassing things that I was ever seen doing was during my PhD period, I entered a poker tournament, and I don't play any poker for a long time now, but I entered it. I didn't just wear glasses. I wore glasses like this. So, Nate Silver, eat your heart out because I'm going all in. Lots of love.